Captain Ta stood in the doorway of the meeting hall and tried not to laugh. Next to him, his aide Jimin was less successful. "Sir," Jimin whispered, "those can't be our seats." But they were. At the giant oval table, between the massive thrones for the lizard-like Sayuk and the floating platforms for the gas-based Orini, sat two tiny chairs. They looked like they belonged in a child's playroom. "Welcome, humans," a deep voice boomed. The Sayuk ambassador, Kraz, approached. He towered over them at 3 meters tall. His scales shimmered green and gold in the bright lights of the hall. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Very much so, Ambassador," Captain Tay replied with a polite bow. He was the official representative of Earth at this first-ever Galactic Confederation Summit. It was too important to start with complaints. "We are honored to be included." Kraz's lip curled slightly, showing the tips of sharp teeth. "Yes, well, we do try to be inclusive." The way he said the word made it sound like a disease. Kraz waved a clawed hand toward the tiny seats. "I must apologize for the seating arrangements. There seems to have been an administrative oversight. We thought humans were smaller." Captain Ta smiled. "No problem at all, Ambassador. We humans are quite adaptable." Without waiting for a response, Ta walked to one of the tiny chairs. It was barely big enough for a 10-year-old human child. He sat down carefully, his knees nearly touching his chest. The chair creaked but held his weight. Jimin followed his captain's lead, sitting on the other small chair. She arranged her diplomatic tablet on her lap, since it would not fit on the tiny section of table in front of them. Around the room, other alien species watched, some with curiosity, others with what seemed like sympathy. The towering Sayuk delegates exchanged glances that Captain Ta recognized well. Disappointment. "Is there a problem, Ambassador?" Tai asked innocently. Kraz's tail twitched. "Not at all. I'm just surprised you can make do with such accommodations." "Humans are known for making do," Ta said with a smile. "We once crossed oceans in wooden boats, and now we cross stars. A small chair is hardly a challenge." The Sayuk ambassador's eyes narrowed. Indeed, he turned away abruptly, his tail nearly knocking over a small table. "The summit will begin in 1 hour. I suggest you make yourselves comfortable." After Kraz left, Jimin leaned toward her captain. "They did this on purpose, didn't they?" Ta nodded slightly. "Almost certainly. The Sayuk have detailed files on every member species. There's no way they didn't know our size." "But why? What do they gain by making us uncomfortable?" Captain Ta watched the Sayuk delegates gather in a corner, occasionally glancing toward the humans. "It's a power play, Jimin. Make us feel small, put us in our place. The Sayuk run this confederation, and they want everyone to know it. Should we request proper seating?" Ta smiled and shook his head. "And give them the satisfaction?" "No, we'll sit here with smiles on our faces. Let them wonder why their little game isn't working." On the other side of the room, another delegate approached. This one was small and blue, with 4 arms and large eyes. "Humans," the blue alien said quietly. "I am Zik of the Mibari. We too have been given unsuitable seating." Ta looked around and noticed several other species shifting uncomfortably in chairs too big, too small, or completely wrong for their body types. "Interesting," Ta said. "Very interesting indeed." As the Galactic Summit began to fill with delegates from 27 worlds, Captain Tai made mental notes of which species face similar treatment. By the time the meeting started, he had counted 7 potential allies. The Sayuk may control the chairs, he thought, but that didn't mean they would control the conversation. "Did you see their faces?" Kraz hissed with laughter as he entered the private Sayuk meeting room. Those humans looked ridiculous on those tiny seats. 5 other Sayuk officials lounged on large, comfortable chairs made specially for their long tails and massive bodies. General Gesh, the military advisor, flicked his tongue in amusement. "It was a clever idea, Kraz," he said. Nothing breaks confidence like physical discomfort. Ambassador Kraz poured himself a drink from a tall bottle. I expected complaints, demands for new chairs. Instead, they just sat there. Humans are strange that way, said Liva, the Sayuk intelligence officer. She pulled up a holographic display showing images of Earth. Our first reports classified them as barely worth watching. Small planet, limited resources, only one moon. The display changed to show human cities, vehicles, and weapons. Their military power is nothing compared to ours, General Jesh added. No plasma weapons, no gravity control. Their ships are slow and noisy. Leva nodded. We put them in the minor curiosity category. But look at this. The display showed a timeline of human advancement. They went from basic flight to space travel in less than a century. From simple computers to artificial intelligence in less than 50 years. Kraz's eyes narrowed. So that's faster than any other species we've encountered, Liva said. Including us. General Jesh stood up suddenly. You think they're a threat? These tiny mammals. I think we shouldn't underestimate them. Liva replied carefully. The tiny chairs were a good start. Keep them off balance. But we need more. Meanwhile, Captain Tai and Jimin had returned to their quarters. Like the chairs in the meeting hall, everything was too small. The beds were short, the shower stall was narrow, and the ceiling was uncomfortably low. They really committed to this joke, Jimin said, bumping her head on a lamp that hung too low. Ta nodded as he tried to fit into a chair that creaked under his weight. It's not a joke. It's a tactic. What do we do? Jimin asked. First, we call Hyun. Tai activated his communication device. Soon, the face of their team's engineer appeared on the screen. Captain, how was the first meeting? Hyun asked cheerfully. Educational, Tai replied. We need your help. How soon can you get to our quarters? 30 minutes later, Hyun arrived with a small toolkit. He looked around the tiny room and laughed. They really don't like us, do they? He said. They're trying to make us feel small, Tai explained. Can you fix it? Hyun walked around, measuring and examining everything. Fix it? No. Make it better? Yes. He opened his toolkit and pulled out several small devices. These are space expanders. We developed them for the colony ships where space was limited. Hyun placed one device under the bed. He pressed a button, and suddenly the bed stretched to a proper human length. It doesn't actually change the physical size, he explained. It just redistributes the mass and adds support where needed. Jimin clapped her hands in delight. That's amazing. How many of these do you have? Tai asked. I brought 20. Enough for our whole team's quarters. Tai thought for a moment. What about making more? Could you make versions for other species too? Hyun considered this. If I had their measurements and body types, probably. Why? Because we're not the only ones being minimized. Ta said, I think it's time we made some friends. While Hyun worked on their quarters, Tai and Jimin reviewed the files they had on the other summit species. There's a pattern, Jimin said, pointing to her screen. All the species given bad accommodations are newer to the Confederation, and all have shown rapid technological advancement in the last 50 years. Just like us, Ta nodded. The Sayuk aren't just being rude. They're afraid. Of what? Earth is peaceful. We've never threatened anyone. It's not what we've done, Ta said. It's what they think we might do, and what we might inspire others to do. Outside their window, the 3 suns of the Confederation capital world were setting. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings, but tonight they had planning to do. Hyun worked through the night. His fingers moved quickly as he modified the space expanders for different body types. Captain Ta had given him the measurements of 7 different species, all facing similar problems with their accommodations. These should work for the Mibari, Hyun said, holding up a small blue device. Their 4 arms need more sideways space. Jimin looked at the collection of gadgets spread across their now comfortable floor. The Sayok will be angry when they see what we've done. They won't see, Tae replied. These modifications are barely visible, and we're not breaking any rules. Hyun held up another device. This one's my favorite. For the Vril delegates. The Vril were tall, thin beings who communicated through light patterns on their skin. Their quarters had ceilings so low they had to stoop constantly. What does it do? Jimin asked. Watch. Hyun placed the device on the floor and activated it. A soft hum filled the air, and suddenly the area above the device seemed to stretch upward, creating a bubble of extra space. It's an optical field generator combined with a gravity modifier, Han explained proudly. The ceiling is still there, but the space between floor and ceiling feels larger. Ta nodded with approval. Perfect. How soon can we deliver these to the other delegations? I can start now, Hyun said, packing the devices into separate containers. I'll tell them they're gifts from Earth. The second day of the summit began with a lecture from the Sayok Science Minister about resource allocation in the galaxy. Captain Ta noticed something interesting as the delegates filed in. The Mibari representatives walked with straight backs instead of hunched over. The Vril delegate skin patterns showed bright, happy colors. And Ambassador Kraz noticed too. His scales darkened with anger as he watched the smaller species take their uncomfortable seats without complaints. Something wrong, Ambassador? Tai asked innocently as he sat in his tiny chair, which now had hidden supports that made it much more comfortable. Your species seems unusually content with your arrangements, Kraz hissed. As I said, humans are adaptable, Tae replied with a smile. During a break in the meetings, Zik of the Mibari approached Ta. Your engineer is very skilled, Zik said quietly. The devices have made our quarters livable. Glad we could help, Tae replied. We humans believe that everyone deserves respect, regardless of size or appearance. Zik's large eyes blinked rapidly. This is not the Sayok way. They believe bigger is better. Stronger means more right to rule. And how do the other species feel about that? Many fear the Sayok. Their fleets are the largest, their weapons the most powerful. Zik paused. But fear does not build a true confederation. Ta nodded. Perhaps we should discuss this further. Would you and the other affected delegations join us for a private dinner tonight? Zik agreed immediately. That evening, General Jesh burst into Kraz's private chamber without knocking. The human delegation is hosting a dinner, he said angrily. They've invited the Mibari, the Vril, the Honto, and 4 other minor species. Kraz set down his drink. So, let them eat together. Our surveillance shows their quarters have been modified. Somehow they've overcome all the discomforts we arrange. Impossible, Kraz snapped. We designed those quarters specifically to be inadequate without appearing deliberately so. See for yourself. Jesh projected a hologram showing the human quarters. The furniture that had once been too small now fit them perfectly. How? Kraz demanded. Their engineer, Leva said, joining them. Hyun. He created devices that modified the space without actually changing the physical structure. Gesh slammed his fist on the table. I told you they were advancing too quickly. This technology. We don't even have anything like it. What are they planning with this dinner? Kraz wondered. Unknown, Leva admitted. But 7 species together could form a significant voting bloc in the Confederation. Kraz's eyes narrowed to slits. Then we need to make sure that doesn't happen. The human quarters hummed with quiet conversation. 7 different species gathered around a table that Hyun had modified to accommodate everyone comfortably. Each delegate sat at the perfect height, with space for wings, tails, or extra limbs as needed. Captain Ta stood to address the group. Thank you all for coming. I think we share a common experience here at the summit. Zik of the Mibari nodded, his large blue head bobbing. The Sayok treat us as lesser beings because we are smaller. Or newer to space travel, added Del, the representative of the insect-like Honto. Or because we don't have big warships, said Wren from the peaceful frill. One by one, each delegate shared a story of Sayak disrespect. The pattern was clear. Any species that wasn't physically large or militarily powerful faced the same treatment. What do they fear from us? Asked Jimin. None of our species have threatened the Sayak. Pell, a round furry delegate from the planet Kix, spoke up. They fear change. The Sayak have controlled the Confederation for 200 years. They don't want to share power. And they especially don't like species who learn quickly, added Zik. My people went from simple farming to advanced computers in just 30 years. The Sayak took 3 times as long. Ta looked around the room. It sounds like we all have something in common. We adapt quickly. We learn fast. We solve problems in new ways. Like your engineer's space devices, Ren said, the light patterns on their skin flashing with admiration. Exactly, Ta said. Now, I have a proposal. The Confederation works on a voting system. No single species can control everything. But the Sayak have allies, Del pointed out. They trade military protection for political support. What if we formed our own alliance? Ta suggested, not based on military power, but on technology and cultural exchange. The room grew quiet as everyone considered this idea. What would we offer each other? Pell asked. We share our innovations, Tai explained. Humans can offer our space modification technology. The Mibari are experts in medicine. The Vril understand light and energy in ways no one else does. The Honto have developed the most efficient farming methods in the galaxy, Del added, getting excited. Soon, everyone was talking about what their species could contribute. As the night went on, the idea of a coalition grew from a suggestion to a real plan. We need a name, Zik said. How about the Adaptive Alliance? Suggested Jimin. Everyone agreed it was perfect. Hidden in the ceiling, a tiny surveillance device recorded everything. In the Sayak Security Center, Leva watched with growing concern. They're forming exactly what we feared, she told General Gesh. A coalition. Gesh's tail lashed angrily. Without weapons or armies, they're no threat. It's not about weapons, Leva insisted. It's about ideas. These species learn from each other. They solve problems differently than we do. Like these space devices, Jesh growled. Our scientists are still trying to understand how they work. Leva nodded. And that's just one example. What happens when they combine all their knowledge? We need to stop this alliance before it forms, Jesh decided. Tell Ambassador Kraz we need to separate these species immediately. Back in the human quarters, the meeting was ending. Each delegate left with new hope and a plan to meet again the next day. After everyone had gone, Jimin turned to Captain Ta. Do you think this will work? The Sayak are powerful. Ta looked at the modified table where species from 7 different worlds had just sat as equals. The Sayak are powerful because they're big, he said. But being big isn't the same as being right. And it certainly isn't the same as being smart. Hyun, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, spoke up. I found something while I was setting up the room. He held up a tiny metallic object, a listening device. The Sayak heard everything. Ta smiled. Good. Then they know we're not intimidated by their tiny chairs anymore. Deep in the Sayak Command Center, a special meeting was taking place. 6 high-ranking Sayak sat around a large table, watching a hologram of Earth. This is why humans worry us, said Dr. Nex, the chief scientist. Look at their development timeline. A hologram showed a series of images. Old wooden ships, then steam engines, then airplanes, then rockets, and finally starships. Most species take thousands of years to go from sailing ships to space travel, Dr. Nex explained. Humans did it in less than 500. Ambassador Kraz hissed with frustration. What makes them advance so quickly? Competition, Dr. Nex said. Humans compete with each other constantly. They had many different countries, governments, and companies all trying to be first, to be best. General Gesh slammed his fist on the table. And now they're helping other species advance too. Our scientists predict that at their current rate, human technology will surpass our own within 20 years, Dr. Nex continued. If they share their methods with the other adaptive species, we could lose control of the Confederation. Kraz finished. Exactly, said Liva. That's why this coalition must be stopped. Meanwhile, Hyun was working in the human quarters. He had taken apart the Sayok listening device and was studying it carefully. Interesting design, he said to Jimin. Very old-fashioned. Jimin looked up from her tablet. Old-fashioned. It's alien technology. Yes, but it uses basic radio transmission. We stopped using this kind of tech 50 years ago. Hyun turned the device over in his hands. Our security systems would have detected it immediately if it was in our embassy on Earth. Captain Tai entered the room. What does that tell us? It tells us the Sayok aren't as advanced as they want everyone to believe. Hyun said. They rely on being big and strong, not on having the best technology. Ta nodded thoughtfully. That's valuable information. What else can you tell from their tech? Hyun walked around the room, scanning with a small device. There are 5 more bugs in here. And he paused, frowning at his scanner. Something bigger in the wall. Carefully, Hyun removed a panel from the wall. Behind it was a box with blinking lights. What is it? Jimin asked. It's a mood manipulator, Hyun said in surprise. It creates low-frequency sounds that humans can't hear, but that make us feel anxious or tired. Tae's eyes narrowed. So not only did they give us tiny furniture, they tried to make us feel bad too. Should I disable it? Hyun asked. No, Ta said after thinking for a moment. Leave it, but can you change what it does? Hyun smiled as he understood. I can reverse it. Make it produce frequencies that help humans feel calm and focused instead. Perfect, Ta said. The Sayok will think we're affected, but we'll actually be at our best. Later that day, the Adaptive Alliance met again, this time in the Mibari quarters. Zik had news. The Sayok are changing the summit schedule, he told the group. They're creating separate tracks for different topics. Each of our species will be sent to different meetings. They're trying to keep us apart, Ta said. Can they do that? Asked Del of the Honto. They control the summit organization, Zik replied. But they gave an official reason. They say it's to maximize efficiency. Ta smiled. Then we'll need to be even more efficient with our time. What do you mean? Ren of the Vril asked, their skin patterns showing confusion. The Sayok are playing a game where they make the rules, Tai explained. But sometimes the best way to win isn't to break the rules, but to play a different game entirely. He turned to Hyun. How quickly can you adapt those space expanders to work as communication devices? Hyun thought for a moment. By tomorrow morning. Why? Because if the Sayok won't let us meet in person, Ta said, we'll find another way to stay connected. The delegates looked at each other with new hope. The Sayok thought size meant power, but the Adaptive Alliance was about to show that sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The grand banquet hall of the Confederation gleamed with light. All 27 species gathered for the summit's midpoint celebration. Floating lights changed colors above tall tables, and low cushions arranged to accommodate different body types. Captain Tai and Jimin entered wearing their best uniforms. In their pockets, they carried Hyun's newest inventions, modified space expanders that now worked as communication devices. Ambassador Kraz approached them, his scales shining with special oils applied for the occasion. Captain Tai, how are you finding the summit so far? Kraz asked, his voice smoothly polite. Very educational, Tai replied with a smile. We've learned much about how the Confederation works. Good, good, Kraz said. I have news that may interest you. We've prepared special seating for tonight's banquet. He gestured across the room where servers were placing name cards on tables. Each species will be seated with others who share similar interests. Kraz continued. Humans will be with the Dorax and Tellurian delegations. I believe you'll find their company stimulating. Ta nodded politely. That sounds thoughtful. But Jimin noticed that both the Dorax and Tellurians were longtime Sayak allies. Meanwhile, all 7 members of the Adaptive Alliance have been placed at different tables, far apart from each other. As Kraz moved away, Jimin whispered, "They're separating us from our friends." As expected, Tae replied calmly. He touched the device in his pocket. A small light blinked, showing it was working. Across the room, Zik of the Mibari touched a similar device in his pocket. Then Del of the Honto, then Ren of the Vril. One by one, all 7 Alliance members activated their communication devices. "Can everyone hear me?" Tai asked quietly, his voice seemingly directed at Jimin. 6 replies came through the tiny earpiece he wore. Yes. The banquet began with a speech from Kraz. He talked about Confederation unity and cooperation, all while the seating arrangement did exactly the opposite. When the food was served, servers brought special chairs for all the delegates. Captain Tae's chair was again comically small, barely able to hold half of him. "Is there a problem with your seating, Captain?" Kraz asked loudly from the head table. Many delegates turned to look. "No problem at all," Tae replied. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small disc. He placed it under his chair and pressed a button. The chair instantly adjusted, expanding to perfectly fit his human body. Gasps came from around the room. Kraz's scales darkened with anger. "What is that device?" he demanded. "Just a simple comfort aid," Tai explained. He stood up and addressed the entire banquet hall. "In fact, we have one for anyone who finds their seating inadequate." From his pocket, he produced several more discs. Hyun, standing near the entrance, came forward with a small box containing dozens more. "These are gifts from Earth," Tai announced, "for any delegate who wishes to sit comfortably, regardless of their size or shape." One by one, delegates from many species came forward to take the devices, not just the Adaptive Alliance members, but others too. "This is outrageous," Kraz hissed. "These unauthorized modifications." "Modifications to what, Ambassador?" Tai asked innocently. "To chairs that were deliberately made uncomfortable. To seating arrangements designed to separate certain delegations." The room grew very quiet. "I wonder," Ta continued, looking around at all the delegates, "why the Confederation spends so much time on seating charts and furniture sizes, instead of discussing important issues like resource sharing and technology exchange." Many delegates nodded in agreement. Some even applauded. Kraz stood frozen, his plan backfiring dramatically. From across the room, Zik caught Ta's eye and gave a subtle forearm gesture of approval. Through their earpieces, the Alliance members could hear each other's satisfaction. "The banquet continues in 30 minutes, Ta said to the room. "Perhaps in that time, we could all consider what truly matters in a confederation of equals." As delegates mingled and tested their new comfort devices, Kraz retreated to the corner where General Jesh waited with a dark expression. "The humans are more dangerous than we thought," Jesh growled. "They're not just adapting to our tricks. They're turning them against us." The morning after the banquet, the Adaptive Alliance met in secret. This time, they gathered in the Vril quarters, where Ren had used Ken's devices to create extra space. "The Sayak are angry," Zik reported. "They've doubled the guards around the conference halls. But they can't stop delegates from talking to each other," Jimin said. "More species approached us after the banquet, asking about our alliance." Captain Ta nodded. "The Sayak's plan is failing. Now we need to move to the next step." He turned to Del of the Honto. "Did your information specialists find anything?" Del's antennae twitched with excitement. "More than we expected. The Honto are good at finding hidden data. We discovered old Confederation records that the Sayak tried to delete." Del handed Tai a data crystal. "These show how the Sayak have been holding back other species for 200 years. Ta passed the crystal to Jimin. What exactly did they do? Jimin inserted the crystal into her tablet and started reading. Resource restrictions, technology embargoes, special regulations that only apply to smaller species, and always with official-sounding reasons. Dell added, for safety, for stability. Pell of the Kicks spoke up. My people were told we couldn't develop faster ships because our navigators weren't skilled enough. But these records show the Sayok just didn't want us traveling too far. The question is, what do we do with this information? Tai asked the group. Zik suggested, we could confront the Sayok directly. They would deny everything. Ren said, light patterns flashing across their skin in a pattern that showed concern. What if everyone knew? Jimin asked. Not just us, but all 27 species. The room grew quiet as they considered this idea. It's risky, Zik warned. The Sayok control most of the communication systems. Hyun, who had been quietly working in the corner, looked up. Not all of them. The comfort devices we gave out yesterday. They can transmit data too. Captain Ta smiled. So anyone who took one of our devices could receive information directly from us. Hyun finished, bypassing Sayok systems entirely. Let's do it, Ta decided. Prepare the data to be shared at the start of today's session. 2 hours later, delegates from all species gathered for the day's meetings. As they took their seats, many placed their human-made comfort devices under their chairs. In the control room, Hyun monitored a screen showing dozens of blinking lights, each one a device ready to transmit. Now, Captain Ta said into his communicator. Hyun pressed a button. Across the conference hall, tablets and data pads lit up with new messages. Delegates looked down in surprise as historical records began to appear on their screens. Ambassador Kraz was in the middle of a speech about Sayok leadership when he noticed the strange activity. Delegates were whispering to each other, showing each other their screens. What is happening? He demanded. No one answered. They were all too busy reading. Ta stood up. Ambassador, perhaps we should discuss some old Confederation policies, specifically the restrictions placed on non-Sayok species. What restrictions? Kraz asked, his voice suddenly nervous. The technology embargoes against the Mibari, Ta said. The resource quotas for the Vril. The travel restrictions on the Honto. With each example, more delegates nodded in recognition. These are necessary regulations, Kraz insisted. For the safety of all. For the power of the Sayok, Ta corrected. The records are clear. Your people have systematically held back other species to maintain control. The room erupted in loud conversation as delegates discussed what they were reading. Tai raised his voice to be heard. The Adaptive Alliance proposes a new Confederation charter, one with protections against discrimination based on size, age, or military power. Delegates from many species began to applaud. In the corner, General Jesh whispered urgently to Kraz, how did they access those records? We deleted them years ago. It doesn't matter now. Kraz hissed back. We need to stop this immediately. Kraz stepped forward, his tall form towering over most delegates. This meeting is suspended. These accusations are baseless and... The records speak for themselves, Zik interrupted, standing on his chair to be seen. We all have copies now. Copies that cannot be deleted. For the first time, the mighty Sayok ambassador seemed at a loss for words. And in that moment of silence, the balance of power in the Confederation began to shift. The Sayok High Command Room was in chaos. 12 high-ranking Sayok officials shouted over each other as Ambassador Kraz tried to restore order. Silence. He finally roared, slamming his tail against the floor. The room quieted. The situation is serious, but not lost, Kraz said. Many species still rely on our protection. They won't risk losing that. General Gesh stepped forward. I've ordered our fleet to begin movement. 20 warships are now in orbit around the Confederation capital. Another 30 are on their way. Good, Kraz nodded. Now we can speak from a position of strength. Liva, the intelligence officer, looked worried. Is a military display wise? It might push neutral species toward the Alliance. We need to show our power, Jesh insisted. Size and strength are what the Sayok are known for. We must remind everyone of that. In the main conference hall, delegates from all 27 species gathered for an emergency session. The proposed new charter was being displayed on large screens. Captain Tai sat with the human delegation, Jimin beside him. Across the hall, members of the Adaptive Alliance waited nervously. Ambassador Kraz entered, followed by 6 Sayok military officers in full uniform. The message was clear. Delegates of the Confederation, Kraz began, his voice powerful. We have considered the proposed charter changes. He paused, looking around the room. The Sayok Dominion rejects these proposals entirely. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Furthermore, Kraz continued, if these changes are approved, the Sayok will withdraw from the Confederation completely. Our protection, our resources, our trade, all will end. The murmurs grew louder. Many delegates looked worried. At this moment, Kraz added, 20 Sayok warships orbit this world. Another 30 are on their way. Think carefully about your vote. With that threat hanging in the air, Kraz stepped back. The head of the Confederation Council, a neutral species called the Vox, stood up. Does anyone wish to speak before we vote? Captain Tag rose from his seat. As he walked to the center of the hall, he seemed small compared to the towering Sayok officers, but his voice was steady. The Sayok believe size equals power, Ta began. They think their big ships and tall bodies make them superior. This is why they gave us tiny chairs when we arrived, to remind us that we are small. He smiled slightly. But on Earth, we have a saying, good things come in small packages. Ta nodded to Hyun, who pressed a button on his tablet. The large screens changed to show a small object, a human device about the size of a hand. This is a portable fusion generator, Tai explained. It powers an entire human city. The Sayok equivalent is the size of this room. The screens changed again. This is a human defense system that can disable ships 10 times its size. Another image appeared. And this is our latest achievement, a propulsion system that allows ships to travel twice as fast as the fastest Sayok vessel, while using half the fuel. Ambassador Kraz stepped forward angrily. You did not share these technologies with the Confederation. Neither did you share yours, Tai replied calmly. But the difference is, we're willing to now. He turned back to the delegates. The Sayok want you to fear losing their protection. But the Adaptive Alliance offers something better, knowledge. Ways to advance that don't depend on size or military power. Ta walked around the room, making eye contact with delegates from every species. Humans mastered miniaturization because we had to. Our world is crowded. Our resources are limited. We learned to do more with less. He stopped in front of the Sayok delegation. The universe is vast, but it's not infinite. Eventually, all species must learn this lesson. The question is whether we learn it together or alone. Tag returned to the center of the hall. The Alliance doesn't ask the Sayok to leave. We ask them to join us as equals, to share rather than control, to grow beyond the belief that bigger is always better. The hall was completely silent now. The choice is yours, Ta concluded. Vote with your conscience, not your fear. And with that, he returned to his seat, his normal-sized human seat. 3 days after Captain Ta's speech, the votes were counted. The new charter passed with 22 species voting in favor, 3 against, and 2 abstaining. The Sayok had lost. In the Grand Council chamber, Ambassador Kraz stood before the assembled delegates. His scales had lost some of their shine, and his proud posture seemed slightly bent. The Sayok Dominion, he began, his voice less booming than before, has considered its position. The room was silent. Everyone expected the Sayok to announce their withdrawal from the Confederation as threatened. We have decided, Kraz continued, to accept the new charter. Surprised murmurs swept through the chamber. Tai and Jimin exchanged glances. Our fleet will remain in service to the Confederation, Kraz added, but we request fair representation in the new leadership structure. The head of the council nodded. Of course, Ambassador. The new charter guarantees equal representation for all member species, regardless of size or military power. Kraz's eyes narrowed at the word equal, but he nodded stiffly. After the session ended, Zik of the Mibari approached Captain Ta. A great victory, Zik said, his forearms making a pattern that indicated respect. But I'm surprised the Sayak stayed. They're practical, Tay replied. They realized that leaving would mean losing access to our technologies, and fighting would risk showing that their big ships aren't as powerful as they claim. Jimin added, pride is important to them, but survival is more important. 1 month later, the Confederation headquarters had been completely redesigned. Human engineers, led by Hyun, had created a new council chamber where every species sat at the same height, with seats that adjusted automatically to each body type. On the final day of the summit, Captain Todd toured the new facility with members of the Adaptive Alliance. The space expanders worked perfectly, Hyun explained as they walked. The building is still the same size, but now it feels comfortable for everyone. Ren of the Vril was especially pleased. No more ducking through doorways, they said, their skin patterns glowing with happiness. In the main hall, they met Ambassador Kraz. The Sayak diplomat seemed different, less imposing somehow, though no smaller in physical size. Captain Tay, Kraz said with a short bow. Your engineers have done impressive work. Thank you, Ambassador, Tay replied. Is the Sayak delegation comfortable with their accommodations? Yes, Kraz admitted, though it is strange to sit at the same level as smaller species. You'll get used to it, Ta said with a smile. As Kraz walked away, Jimin whispered, do you think the Sayak have really changed? Change takes time, Tai answered, but they're learning an important lesson. True power isn't about how much space you take up. The final ceremony of the summit included a surprising announcement. The Confederation Council had created a new position, Director of Technology Exchange, and they had appointed Hyun to the role. This program will allow all species to share their innovations, the Council had explained. No more secrets, no more holding back progress. As Hyun accepted the position, his eyes met Captain Ta's across the room. They both smiled. Later, at a small celebration with the Adaptive Alliance members, Tai raised a glass. 2 tiny chairs, he said. Everyone laughed. Without them, we might never have formed this alliance, Zik pointed out. Sometimes the greatest achievements come from the smallest beginnings, Ta said, and the greatest embarrassments come from underestimating others. Outside the windows of the celebration hall, the 3 suns of the Confederation capital were setting. In orbit above, ships from 27 worlds moved peacefully together. Among them were the massive Sayak warships, still the largest in the fleet. But size, as everyone now understood, wasn't everything. In the new Confederation, even the smallest voice would be heard, and the smallest chair could change the galaxy.